that summary just pretty much says it all. I don't think we need this speech now, but we'll go ahead with the formality of it. So hello.
Hello.
Yes, when I speak, I expect you all to respond like obedience culture. So we'll do that again. Hello.
Hello.
It's good. I prefer hello, Mr. Larkin. Hello. Thank you. I'm honoured to have been asked to speak to you today. I've been asked to talk to you about the general theme of making poetry better, and more specifically about the democratisation of poetry. So I'm going to take you through some of my history, share with you some of my experiences and insights, and give you my perspective on the current situation and attempt to proffer some advice. Now, warning, I am going to talk about myself quite a lot. A poet talking about himself quite a lot. Who'd have thought? It's one of my favourite subjects and the thing I know most about. But first of all, I want to tell you about Howard Wilkinson. Howard Wilkinson became Leeds United manager in October 1988. And he immediately set to removing all the photographs of players from the glory days of the 1960s and 70s under Don Reddy. This wasn't out of disrespect for the great man and his team and their achievements. Rather, the motivation was to start afresh, not to constantly be compared negatively to another team. He led the team to the top of the football pyramid 3 years later. Leeds United were crowned the last ever Football League champions in 1992. Is this relevant? I hope so. In the 1990s, I became very excited by poetry. I'd always been interested in poetry from childhood through out of school, and I always wrote creatively, despite a distinct lack of encouragement to do so. Every homework set, one hand went up. No Larkin, before you ask, can't write a poem. It's not appropriate for quadratic equations. In the 1990s, I was just discovering what I considered to be a vibrant medium of creative expression, namely what people were calling performance poetry. Then performance poetry used elements of music, theatre and stand-up. Its practitioners were more likely to be found in entertainment forum than in hideout arts forum. It was looked down upon by those who looked to protect the value of a so-called literary poetry. The written form of poetry that they revered was proper poetry, and it was better poetry. Now this prejudice against what I would say is an older and truer and more sophisticated art form was internalised by some of these practitioners, who could not help but swim with the tide of the rather powerful establishment view. I remember a conversation with Kevin Cadwell-Ender, who was a poet who I thought was a sublimely funny, insightful social commentator. He was doing an English literature degree at the same university as me at the time as a mature student, and he considered that the performance poetry that he was part of was not the real thing, and the real thing was the thing that he was studying. He said he wanted to write proper poetry like John Donne. John did, you idiots. I remember being taken aback by this conversation. I couldn't quite work out for many years why I disagreed with him so strenuously. I studied English literature as part of my degree, and I would go away with an appreciation of Auden, the other Larkin, Owen, Sassoon, the grudging appreciation of modernists such as Eliot, and I even got an introduction to the then contemporary poets such as Tony Harrison, who I was lucky enough to share a stage with early in my career. In terms of making my own poetry better, it was the exposure to these performance poets like Kevin, Nick Toptek, Jules, John Hagley, Chloe Poems, Rob G and John Cooper Clarke that were the inspiration, the direction to make my own poetry better. As a teenager entering a higher education, having only had a direct poetry from formal literature education, I had been attempting to write poetry that was as complicated and oblique as I could possibly make it. My crude formula was that better poetry was intelligent poetry, and intelligent poetry was academic and intellectual. I was disabused of this notion as I witnessed the lying application of poetic thinking, the successful dissemination of concepts by skilled oral practitioners. I became almost a zealot for performance poetry, and then for spoken word, as it became known, refusing any offers of publication and denying any access to my work in print. I went on to plough the vast majority of my working career into the promotion of spoken word. That's why I'm poor. I built up material of my own and became a competent performance poet in my own right, running a number of performance poetry gigs in the north of England, until I did such a bad gig one night supporting Linton Kwesi Johnson that I had to leave town. It's a huge exaggeration, but not the truth. I moved to Oxford, part to be nearer to London, where I envisioned there'd be more performing opportunities. Disappointed me, I didn't find a huge amount going on at that time. If there was to be a stage to perform, I realised that I'd have to build it for myself. I started Hammer and Tone with Jim Thomas in October 2003. Jim was a great political performance poet who I collided with in my environmental activist circles. He'd been to the United States and had come across poetry slams, and he tried to sell me on the idea. I was a bit sceptical at first, but I went along with him to one, and I won it, and I thought, that's quite good actually. The next year I would compete in Canada in an international slam against the then US National Poetry Slam champion and a whole host of highly motivated, seasoned poetry slammers from around the globe, and I won the title. Thanks, Mum. I'll buy you that point later. This further weighed me to the idea. Back in 2003, I agreed reluctantly to include a poetry slam at our new event, and Jim agreed reluctantly to include 2 professional guest artists. But it was this marriage of open access, professionalism, and live peer judging that saw gigs grow rapidly, with people queuing down the street for our monthly gigs and 500 plus turning up for international specials. The quality of work on show rose as time went on. That was 21 years ago last month, and in that time the network has flourished. I work with poets who wanted to replicate the model in their town or city, and we have regular programmes of slam events, professional touring network throughout the south of England, a regular Edinburgh Fringe runs, and a national slam final at the Royal Albert Hall, where we invited winners of slams from all over the UK. All this was done without funding. We worked hard to build up an economy and to break down barriers to participation. Interestingly, about 5 years ago, I went to a poetry event at an Oxford college where there were poets performing and then doing a Q&A. One of the poets, an alumni of the college who was at university in the peak of Hammer and Tongue's growth in Oxford, when events were marketed to the extent that you could possibly not notice. The poet was asked what poetry she was influenced by when she was at Oxford, and her answer was that there was no poetry in Oxford when she was there. Oxford, she said then, was a poetry-free zone. I didn't ask the obvious question, I knew what her answer would have been. Question: why did the hipster burn his mouth? Answer: because he drank artisan coffee before it was cool. I'm quite proud that with Hammer and Tongue we decided to have non-smoking venues a few years before the smoking ban. Way before fourth wave feminism, Me Too or Black Lives Matters, Hammer and Tongue looked to represent diversity of background on our bills. The ideal for us was to have 2 guest performers on a poster, one who was not male and one who was not white. Invariably we succeeded. We created an entertaining space as well as safe space. In addition to great variety of styles, there would hopefully be a compare and true laughs from the audience without hurting anyone's feelings. Again, invariably I succeed, but sometimes I fail badly. I like to think we were influential in some way, that we helped inspire others to take poetry into a new era. I like to think that we did our bit to present the democratisation of poetry to the UK. At around the same time as this surge in spoken word, the world of written word poetry was facing some challenges. Sales of poetry books hit a low point. Some commentators derided the scene. Stephen Fry, in his 2005 book, The Ode Less Travelled, claimed that too many poets defaulted to a rather inward, placid and bloodless response to the world, producing a dreary, self-indulgent, randomly lineated dribble, or arms dribble, as he called it. In 2014, Jeremy Paxman, judging the Forward Poetry Prize, accused poetry of conniving at its own irrelevance, lamenting its failure to engage with ordinary people. Despite, or maybe because of, the perilous position proper poetry found himself in, negative judgments about spoken word abound. How did this come about? I was very much impressed by Matthew Said's book, Rebel Ideas, The Power of Diverse Thinking, in which he argues against what he describes as homophily, the tendency of individuals to associate and bond with similar others. In the book, he demonstrates with the example of the 1980s Conservative government. At that time, the cabinet was exclusively drawn from Oxford and Cambridge University graduates. Imagine that! So people who were intelligent enough to get through quite a challenging degree, no lack of intelligence. They did, however, contrive to introduce the poll tax, which by any reasonable measure was a dunder-headed tax. For those who are unaware of what the poll tax or community charge was, it replaced the old rate system and meant an across-the-board tax where a multimillionaire living alone in a mansion would potentially pay the same amount as each pensioner living in a council flat. Some households would prove to be more than £1,500 worse off, a lot of money in 1989. Meanwhile, others, a small minority, were no less than £10,000 a year better off. This led to riots all over the UK, and this was one of the major factors in the demise of the Margaret Thatcher administration. Nicholas Ridley, the Secretary of State for the Environment responsible for its implementation, was the son of literal aristocrat Viscount Ridley and grew up in a magnificent estate known as Ballagton Hall. In an interview at the time, when asked what an elderly couple who didn't have the cash to pay should do, Nicholas Ridley replied, apparently seriously, well, they could always sell a picture. This cuts to the essence of the problem. When smart people from a singular background are placed into decision-making groups, they become collectively blind, individually intelligent, collectively stupid, making monumentally stupid decisions because they are not exposed to our diversity of thinking. Forgive, they know not what they do. So many people have creative abilities. The Arts Council's approach of Arts for All or Great Arts and Culture for Everyone have encouraged the sort of diversity that Hammer and Tongue and the wider spoken word community have engendered. And by diversity, I mean different things. Diversity of backgrounds, and importantly to me, diversity of style. Diversity is strength in my view. Huge diversity has come about because of the democratisation of poetry, which has seen a distinct rise in the quality of particular kinds of poetry, as people have come to poetry from all sorts of different backgrounds and art forms. We have seen significant growth in diversity within the bracket of spoken word. We've seen the development of spoken word theatre, seen the strong influence and involvement of spoken word in music. We have seen comedic styles develop, performers be accepted by stand-up audiences, and we've seen strides taken in multimedia publishing. As a result of the door being opened and people experimenting with, being developed by and shaped by live audiences. Consider the difference in style between Disraeli and Vanessa Kasuba, two successful poets who started in the same city, Bristol. Disraeli, coming to spoken word as a young hip-hop artist developing an a cappella style which resonated with spoken word audiences, who now incorporates spoken word storytelling to his spellbinding mixture of hip-hop and folk. Vanessa, who dived straight into spoken word as an 18-year-old who had scribbled poems on notebooks whilst at private school, and now produces evocative poetry with emotional and comic impacts, with titles such as Not Worth Shaving Your Arsehole For. Consider the difference between Cat Francois and Rob Orton, two London poets. Cat Francois, who came from a theatrical background and used her skill to enthrall spoken word audiences with vivid, real-world story pieces, which often contain dramatic monologues, who last month performed a commissioned poetry piece with the BBC Symphony Orchestra. Rob Orton, as he states himself, in 2008 started saying things aloud to groups of people without wanting them to respond verbally. Some call this stand-up comedy, some call it stand-up poetry, he says. He has now occupied a liminal space between two related genres, winning awards for the best joke of the Edinburgh Fringe and delighting live and TV audiences along the way. All of these artists cut their teeth in the era of poetry slams. Each of them identify as, and will be identified as poets. Each of them, I'm proud to say, are featured as guests at Hammer and Tongue events. Which of them would have found a successful practice as a poet without the spoken word opportunities afforded to them. If the gatekeepers of poetry had remained editors of poetry journals and publishers, I'm confident none of them would have been known as a poet today. The quality of those four poets, I would say, is not in any doubt. For those of us looking close up, the diversity of style and approach is also abundantly clear to see. It is, however, apparently not seen by some commentators. In 2018, Rebecca Watts, a prized short-lived poet in her own right, wrote a scathing attack on spoken word in an article in PN Review, which has become infamous in spoken word circles. The article, entitled "The Cult of the Noble Amateur," came about because she was asked to review recent Ted Hughes award-winning performance poet Holly Milish's collection, Plum. She just declined to review Plum on the grounds that to do so would imply that it deserves to be taken seriously as poetry. Instead, she submitted an essay that lumped together three poets, Holly, Kay Tempest, and Ruby Coe. The article started, "Why is the poetry world pretending that poetry is not an art form? I refer to the rise of a cohort of young female poets who are currently being lauded by the poetic establishment for their honesty and accessibility. Buzzwords for the open denigration of intellectual engagement and rejection of craft that characterises their work. The short answer is that artless poetry sells," she said. The article goes on to rip apart the work of Holly Milish and Ruby Coe. Her crude assessment, not atypical of casual establishment glances, was that this popular movement that had come about as a result of social media was dumbing down literature. I had met Rebecca Watts since. I was on a panel with her and Simon Armitage at Trinity College, Oxford, called The Future of Poetry, and she was a very pleasant and articulate individual. I'd enjoyed the poetry of hers that I'd been exposed to. She's a bright individual. But remember the lesson from Matthew Said: when smart people from a singular background are placed into a decision-making group, they become collectively blind. Rebecca was born in the south of England and studied English literature at Cambridge and then Oxford. Forgive her. She knows not what she knows. What Watts does is take a pot shot of what she doesn't really know what she's taking a pot shot of. What? I like that, thanks. For her, the rules for writing, the measures of quality were inherited from written culture and academic culture. She was blind to the huge diversity of the three writers that she lambasted. Kay Tempest, if Rebecca had taken time with a fair mind to assess, she would have determined uses a variety of influences, often writing in a Shakespearean form to create epic works in a classical tradition of Homer-style oratory storytelling. Ruby Coe, from what I can see, has written Basho-style short-form pieces that are culturally more similar to the randomly lineated page style that Stephen Fry tried. Holly Milish generally writes autobiographical, issue-based pieces in a relatively straightforward rhyming form, without the hyperbole and high drama that Kay employs. Three more different poets she could have chosen to lump together. Rebecca didn't have the tools to recognise what the various qualities of the three poets were. Her inherited mode of analysis was from the academic 20th century rules of new criticism, which advocated close reading of text only, forbid consideration of anything from beyond the margin, the context, the voice, the biography, the intention of the author. This culture dictated an intimate, internalised experience and ignored important poetic elements that could be vital ingredients of what a poem is. In trying to assess these three poets from a position, she was, to quote Stuart Lee mocking James Corden, like a dog listening to classical music. By definition, the poets that she was dismissing as amateur were actually professional poets by virtue of them being professionally engaged poets, whereas Rebecca, as far as I'm aware, though offering no doubt decent work, was hardly earning a living from her poetry, and thus was, by definition, an amateur. It hits me, people like me in the eye, when there is such an abrupt assault on what we do. When we are immersed in our own world, it can come as a surprise to be faced with such ignorance and hostility. But it's important to be broad-minded and not to take such assaults too personally. We all strive, hopefully, to make our work as good as we can, and we should listen to consider all advice, whether we take it on board or not. Do Rebecca Watts and her ilk have a point? Does accessibility dumb down poetry? Does mass participation dilute quality? Who is the arbiter of quality? That's not a rhetorical question. I'll answer it. It's me. At least it is today, by virtue of being asked to present to you by the good people of Kent Poetry CIC. In terms of the question, does mass participation dilute the quality of poetry? Of course, I would say not. Quite the opposite. But then, I am me, and my perspective is as unique as Rebecca Watts is. Everyone's opinion has to be understood in the context of where they're coming from. What is better poetry to me differs categorically from what is better poetry to Rebecca Watts, because of value systems we've cultivated through our lives and our poetry careers. My perspective has come about because of my particular history and circumstances. Inevitably, there's a massive class element. I often start a gig by saying that I was the first in my family ever to go to university. And that I'm a prime example of what happens when you educate scum. I did a philosophy degree, hence no job. I wasn't part of the Blair-era swell in university admissions. I had very troubled teen years. Who'd ever thought of that? Oh, it was troubled teen years. I managed to scrape into one of the new universities, one which is in the bottom three in the league table, and I thrived in university education, away from some of the social problems I've been facing. I proved to myself that I had intelligence, ability with language, that I could unpack dense philosophical theories. I could write. I was drawn to poetry in another media from Britain, poetry, at the start of my journey, because I had an instinct that I could develop it. Importantly, it was also part of a counterculture movement, unapologetically opposed to the establishment. And so I have, like many people with a similar background, found my way to poetry through media that's been more accessible to me, through live spoken word, through theatre, through music, more recently through digital media. One of my favourite press quotes about my work is, "Larkin creates theatre that will speak equally to those who find their poetry from classic literary forms or subversive musicians. Run to his show, Uptown Magazine, a perhaps rather generous assessment from a benevolent Canadian expressing a sentiment that I suspect would be more unlikely to come from a British journalist who would be more likely to be blinded by generations of class prejudice." The refrain, "but he wouldn't stand up on the page, he wouldn't stand up on the page," from a succession of commentators annoyed by the like of what I do, still rings in my ears to this day. I can point to a large number of definite examples of explicit class prejudice, having put myself forward as a poet living in Oxford. Countless subtle acts of prejudice, and who knows how many unconscious acts. The words of the author Hugh Warwick on the subject will stay with me for a long time. With no skin in the game, he took me aside one day to tell me, "You're clever, you're working class, and you're normal." And they're terrified of that. They don't know what to do with you. So my path has been very different from Rebecca Watts'. From the start of my development as a poet, I was part of a counterculture. I was surrounded by left-wing and anarchist thinkers. I developed a ranting style, where bombast and making meaning immediately apparent were discouraged of poets following a new criticism value system. They were of value to me on stage. I learned through experience to temper my hard edges with comedy and developed a stand-up material to support my work. I reached audiences I could not reach through stand-up, through lyricism and a parallel music career, learning the particular differences and nuances when it came to impregnating an audience's consciousness when words are melded with rhythm and melody. I reached theatre audiences, integrating poetry into long-form dramatic narratives, and then when it finally came to agreeing to have something of my work represented in print, I created a multimedia publication, the like of which, as far as I'm aware, hasn't been produced before. To do this, I reviewed my work with the help of critical friends and assessed which pieces held value on the page and which needed the context of the gig and a live audience reaction, which needed the song, the photograph of the poetry mural, not Muriel, she wasn't involved, and the explanation. Who's this Muriel? Never heard of her. Don't accuse me of it. Or the broadcast with the historical context, and I created web links to take you to the appropriate media for the piece. Sometimes not even including the text at all, but replacing it with a picture. And I set it out like an adventure novel. with a questionnaire to give the reader or consumer a starting point and their own question and their own unique journey through my work is hopefully suited to how they like to consume poetry. And I hope you do judge a book by its cover, because this is it. And it's created with the very talented artist Joshua Squashua, and he points to the multifaceted nature of it. It makes the point, hopefully, as does my life work today, that there is no one poetry, no one value system. Rather, there are poetries thriving in varying media. Print is only one of them. It is not, as Don Patterson rightly says, that poetry is a broad church. It can be many churches, and we need worship at all of them. So I am a stage poet, a spoken word poet, a stand-up poet, a musical poet, a theatrical poet, a digital media poet, and a fledgling written poet. Rebecca is a written poet. The frustrating thing to me is that she's more likely to be considered part of the establishment, and I am to most an outsider. I've come to where I am now, part as a result of class barriers and the timely democratisation of poetry through spoken word in the digital era. My access makes me more insightful, in my not so humble opinion. Access and outreach are not buzzwords for the denigration of intellectual engagement and rejection of craft. They are actually essential for a healthy, thriving culture. As I might add, importantly, is peer review. But can accessibility be a double-edged sword? Mikhail Gorbachev, when interviewed on the Clive Anderson Talks Back show on Channel 4 in 1996, was asked what he thought was the greatest achievement of the Soviet Union. And he replied, universal education. He was then asked what he thought brought down the Soviet Union. And he said, universal education. I always thought that Blessing and Curse of short-form poetry was the next that anyone could write it. The net is cast wide, but you still have to sift through a lot of Thames water discharge before you find a fish. The filter of the poetry slam, I've always thought, was a relatively crude but effective one. The whole notion of judgment meant that the previous era's open mic balls were scared off. Those that did nothing to affect an audience in some way were exposed and didn't come back or adapt. To me, the slam is a useful tool, but not the be-all and end-all of spoken word. I've never written to try and win a slam. I've written to move on, having developed sensibilities and skills before the era of poetry slams. Now we have generations of poets who did not practice their work before poetry slams became the dominant mode. What we've learned from the lesson of Matthew Said is that there's a danger when people from a singular background are placed into decision-making groups. One central tenet of the hammer and tongue slams, which might seem insignificant to some, but I always held it to be very important, was that judges were to be random members of the audience. I remember one time at a national final, an older person challenged me saying, shouldn't you have professional judges at this level? The whole point for me is that the power of judgment for a poetry slam is in the hands of random audience members. That was the original design of Mark Smith, which I appreciated and took pains to implement. It's the thin end of the wedge when we start nominating judges on the basis of supposed expertise. It becomes something else then. That is going back to an era where poetry was guided by gatekeepers with their own particular value set. All we do if we do that is replace one set of gatekeepers with another. And there's a danger in becoming insular if we mark our own homework. I wrote a chapter in a Routledge publication about spoken word in the UK, about the danger over time of homogenisation of spoken word in poetry slams. All my efforts in programming guest artists with a diversity of style over many years were designed to prevent this. As Faye Roberts illuminated when talking about the diversity of styles of people who came to slams shortly after their introduction in the UK, this included sonic writers, page poets, musicians trying poetry, comedians rhyming, rappers, ranty political socialist poetry from full-on beret-wearing, old-school fish-raising geezers with beards, and massive hippies with their bardic tradition. I have been proud that the Hammer and Tongue network and the spoken word scene and slam scene generally have retained this diversity. However, I feel there are signs that the much prophesied homogenisation is on the horizon. The biggest loss and the biggest danger, as I see it, is the potential loss of its comedic and entertaining elements. The potential reasons for this are multifaceted and I won't go into them at this juncture, but I want to tell you an anecdote about an incident at a National Slam final at the Albert Hall. At this particular one, competing in the group stages was Scott Tyrrell. Scott is a great poet who offers an honest blend of sensitive and humorous, self-effacing, autobiographical work. He was fresh to his victory in the Radio 4 Poetry Slam. Struggling in the break to find new judges who hadn't judged before, who I didn't know, I reluctantly gave the scorecard to someone who was sat in the front row and had been asking to judge all day. He was known to me. He's a very talented poet, a highly politicised individual who only produces political work. And he's often been very vocal and forthright about the kind of guests that were booked at Hamilton. Scott did a poem called Coitus Interruptus, an extremely funny piece which brought the house down. I reckon if you'd asked each person their favourite poem of the day, the majority would have mentioned that one. Scores came up, all very high, apart from one stinking low score from my friend, making the point that he didn't want such frivolity on this stage. Personally, I have never wanted any particular style to dominate. I value diversity within a scene, and I see the social and political value of comedy. Scott missed out by a tiny margin and didn't progress in the slam. If we define ourselves too narrowly, we risk seeing eating itself. So, for better or worse, the slam sinks. The slam has served as a crude filter that might not always have chosen the best poet, but has always chosen good poets who connect with the audience. It served poetry pretty well, I think, to date. But where are we now? I feel like we're heading into a post-slam era and just finding our feet. Hammer and Tongue is 21 years old and the scene has come of age. Bob Dylan has won the Nobel Prize for Literature and the Times, they are a change. Simon Armitage is the best poet laureate we've ever had, the first to make great use of broadcast media to make his own work more accessible. He also invites a multitude of perspectives from the King of England to hip-hop artist Loyal Kana. Spoken word has become accepted as a serious art form in many circles. Major literary prizes have been awarded for spoken word works, the Forward Prize being the latest to include a category of Best Performed Poem last year, won by the excellent Bogdan Piasecki. Still though, universities are slow to catch up. Having fought for decades for spoken word, having worked to let it define in its own right, having worked to create a space to keep it away from the inevitable crippling judgment of the establishment, I find myself interested in a greater variety of poetry. Since publishing this collection that included some of my work in print, I am now a lot more interested in the written word, generally. I am Howard Wilkinson, post-1992. My team have won the league and I'm now rehanging a picture of Billy Bremner in the chamber. I am looking at embarking on a PhD in poetry, class and media, an autoethnographical study and an autobiographical multimedia collection with the working title of Burning Philip Larkin, which will include written poetry from which I will gladly receive advice from anyone with acumen in that area, including Rebecca Watts, if she offers it. In doing this study, I hope to legitimise my own poetry, further demonstrate diverse media applications for poetry output, illuminate the class barriers that still sadly exist in our art form, and become qualified to lead further education courses that make a real world impact on those wishing to embark on a career in poetry in the digital age. For people starting out now, I believe there will be opportunities going forward, and I like to think that more enlightened times lay ahead of us because of the previous decade's success in bringing diverse poetry to a diversity of people, and just about breaking into the mainstream. If that's you, I wish you luck. I wish for the collapse of the neoliberal economy, and a swelling of funding in the arts and the public sector for you. What's been important in recent times is that everyone's horizons have been broadened. We have all been washed out of our particular rock pools by mass participation and a plethora of connections that the technological era has thrown up. If only there were organisations and people locally who value both spoken word and written word poetry. You've got people together in a room who will look to help you swim through the waters of the wide open poetry sea. I encourage anyone to dive in. If any lesson has been learned from history so far, from my history so far, the rest of history I'll comment on at a later date, it's that if the state doesn't suit you, build your own. Validation from people with narrow, self-interested agendas will not likely come. So don't waste your time waiting for it. Find your own path. Lastly, if we in this room today are the collective managers of the future of poetry, if my assessment is good and we are at a place where we can expect respect for diversity, having made the case for some undervalued modes of poetic expression, if we are Howard Wilkinson in 1992, then we need to believe in what we do and hold our own. And we need not to sell Eric Cantona to Manchester United for about £1.2 million. Thanks for listening to me. I wish you the best in your future.